They told him to stay back because he was too young, his helmet slipping over his ears as snow fell quietly on the shattered village. But the Germans kept coming anyway, and in the next 11 days, everything would change in ways nobody could have predicted. It was late winter, the kind of cold that burned your lungs and turned every breath into pain. And the front line had gone quiet in that dangerous way that never lasted long. Houses stood broken like forgotten toys, trees snapped like matchsticks scattered across frozen ground, and somewhere beyond the smoke and the silence, German units were moving forward, slow and confident, believing the enemy ahead of them was weak and easy to break. The boy crouched behind a stone wall with a rifle that felt too heavy for his thin arms, listening to older soldiers whisper that he shouldn't even be there, that this wasn't a place for kids who still looked like they belonged in school. He wasn't supposed to fight. He was supposed to carry messages, haul supplies, stay out of the way, and most importantly, stay alive. That was the plan everyone agreed on. Then the shelling started, and plans don't mean much when the world explodes around you. Everything fell apart in seconds. Artillery slammed into the village with a sound that swallowed all other sounds. Walls collapsed in clouds of dust and stone. Men screamed for medics who couldn't reach them, and orders vanished into the noise and chaos. When the smoke cleared enough to see again, many of the older soldiers were dead or wounded, bleeding in the rubble, and the boy found himself alone, heart pounding so hard he thought it might break through his chest, staring down a street filled with advancing German infantry who had no idea what was waiting for them. Quick thing before we continue, hit subscribe if you want more incredible WW2 stories like this, because we dig deep into moments that sound impossible but actually happened, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. What those German soldiers didn't know was that the kid shaking behind the wall wasn't running, wasn't crying, and wasn't frozen in fear anymore. Something inside him had snapped into place, cold and focused like a switch being flipped, and by the time the smoke drifted away and the dust settled, he'd made a decision that would turn him into a nightmare the Germans wouldn't forget. He joined the fight by lying about his age, like so many others did in those desperate times, driven by anger, loss, and the simple need to survive in a world that had gone insane. Officers laughed when they saw him, called him a child playing soldier, and sent him away from the real fighting because they didn't want his death on their conscience or his blood on their hands. But war doesn't care how old you are, doesn't check identification or ask permission, and it was coming for him whether they liked it or not. In the days before the attack, he watched and learned with the kind of focus that only comes from knowing your life depends on every detail. He studied how German patrols moved through the ruins, how they spread out when they felt nervous, how they bunched up when they felt safe, how they trusted their numbers and their training. He memorized the sound of their boots crunching on frozen ground, the way they paused before crossing open ground, the moments when they relaxed and dropped their guard, and the patterns they followed without even knowing they had patterns. When the village fell silent after the shelling stopped and the echo faded, German soldiers pushed forward with rifles ready but spirits high, convinced the defenders had broken and scattered like they always did. The boy waited behind his stone wall, pressed flat against the cold surface that bit through his thin uniform, counting steps in his head as shadows moved closer, measuring distance with his eyes, controlling his breathing the way the veterans had taught him before they died. The first shot echoed sharp and loud through the empty streets, dropping the lead soldier before anyone understood what happened or where it came from. Confusion spread instantly like fire through dry grass. Men shouted in German, voices high with panic. Rifles swung wildly in every direction, fingers tight on triggers. Then the second shot rang out from a completely different position, and another body hit the ground hard, and the panic turned into chaos. He moved fast, faster than fear, changing positions between shots like a ghost slipping through walls, crawling through rubble that tore his hands and knees, using doorways, windows, and shell craters like he'd been doing it his whole life instead of learning it 5 minutes ago. The Germans fired back with everything they had, bullets chewing into walls and kicking up stone dust, but they were shooting at ghosts and shadows, wasting ammunition on nothing while the real threat stayed invisible. By nightfall, the street was quiet again except for the wind moving through broken buildings, and when he finally stopped shaking enough to think clearly, he realized he'd killed more men than he could count on both hands. He didn't feel proud of it. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt empty inside, hollowed out like the buildings around him. But he was still breathing and his heart was still beating. And that meant he'd won today, even if winning felt like losing. Word spread fast through what was left of the unit, whispered at first like a ghost story, then spoken out loud with a mixture of disbelief and respect, about the kid who wouldn't die no matter what got thrown at him. Officers stopped telling him to leave and find somewhere safe. Soldiers started handing him extra ammunition without being asked, sharing their rations, treating him like one of them instead of a child who'd wandered into the wrong place. Over the next 11 days, the fighting never really stopped. It just paused and started again like a broken machine that couldn't turn off. German patrols probed the area again and again, trying to push through the ruined ground and take what was left of the village. And every single time they did, the boy was there somewhere in the shadows, watching with eyes that had learned to see everything, waiting with the patience of a hunter, and striking first before they ever knew he was there. He learned to move only when the wind blew and covered the sound of his boots, to fire only when he was absolutely sure of the shot, and to disappear before anyone could pinpoint his position or organize a response. Hunger gnawed at him constantly, turning his stomach into a painful knot. Sleep came in stolen minutes, not hours, his eyes snapping open at every sound. His hands blistered and bled from crawling through rubble. His uniform hung on him like rags. But he kept going because stopping meant dying, and dying wasn't an option. German soldiers grew nervous in ways that surprised their officers and broke their training. They stopped walking upright like soldiers and started moving hunched over like scared animals. They spread out more, putting distance between themselves and their comrades. They fired into empty buildings and shadows that didn't move, wasting ammunition on fear. Some refused to advance at all, digging in and claiming they needed orders, convinced the village was cursed or haunted by something that couldn't be killed. One captured German soldier later said it felt like being hunted by something you couldn't see, something that knew exactly where you were at all times and was just waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Every step forward felt like the last one you'd ever take. Every breath might be your final one. And the waiting was worse than the fighting, because at least in a fight you could see your enemy and shoot back. The count kept rising steadily like water filling a bucket. 10 confirmed kills. 20. 40. Nobody was sure of the exact number because counting bodies in active combat is messy and imprecise. But bodies piled up in the streets and alleyways, and German attacks slowed to a crawl as units refused to advance into what felt like a death trap. Commanders couldn't understand how such a small force was holding them back, how one ruined village was costing them so many men and so much time. The truth was brutal and simple and impossible to accept. It wasn't a force holding them back. It wasn't a platoon or even a squad. It was one boy with a rifle who refused to stop fighting, refused to run, refused to accept that he was supposed to lose. On the 7th day, they tried to flush him out with heavy fire that would have killed anyone in the open, pounding the village with artillery until almost nothing stood above waist height. He was buried once under falling rubble, dug himself out with bleeding hands while his lungs screamed for air, and kept shooting as soon as he could see again. Smoke filled his lungs and made every breath taste like burning metal. His ears rang non-stop from the explosions, a constant high-pitched whine that never stopped. He thought he might die there, buried alive in the frozen ground. He didn't. By the 10th day, German units pulled back entirely, leaving the ground littered with the dead they couldn't recover. And when friendly troops finally pushed forward expecting to find a defensive position, they found him sitting against a wall, exhausted beyond words, filthy beyond recognition, and barely conscious, his rifle still across his knees and his fingers still on the trigger. Only then did officers start counting seriously, walking the ground with notepads, checking after-action reports, comparing notes from different units, and slowly realizing the scale of what had happened in this forgotten village. In just 11 days of continuous fighting, the boy they'd called too young to fight, the kid they tried to send home for his own safety, had killed 104 German soldiers, and the number was probably higher because some bodies were never found or counted. The number stunned everyone who heard it. Veterans who'd fought since the beginning of the war, who'd seen everything combat had to offer, shook their heads in disbelief and asked to see the reports themselves. Some didn't want to believe it at all because it sounded like propaganda or a mistake. But the evidence was there, written in blood and broken ground and German casualty reports that matched up too well to be wrong. He didn't celebrate when they told him. He didn't smile or boast. When asked how he did it, he shrugged with shoulders that barely had the strength to move and said he didn't have a choice, because if he stopped fighting they would have killed him, and that simple truth was the only explanation he had or needed. The story spread beyond the unit, then beyond the division, then beyond the front lines, turning into legend while the boy himself stayed quiet, haunted by faces he couldn't forget and nights he couldn't sleep through without waking up in cold sweats. War had taken his childhood in 11 days, replaced it with something harder, darker, and far heavier to carry for the rest of his life. He survived when so many didn't, but the cost followed him long after the fighting moved on and the guns went silent. When the war finally ended and people went home to rebuild their lives, they talked about generals who made brilliant decisions, tanks that won crucial battles, and big moments that changed the course of history. But stories like his reminded everyone that history also turns on single moments nobody planned for, single decisions made by scared kids, and people nobody expected to matter who changed everything anyway. They'd called him too young to fight. They were wrong. Thanks for watching this story from WW2 Vault. If you want more true combat stories that sound unreal but actually happened, make sure you're subscribed, because the next one might change how you see this war forever.